A dry wind sweeps across the basalt plains east of the Jordan River, carrying with it the dust of an empire on the brink. In the distance, two vast armies, one seasoned by years of rapid campaigns, the other backed by centuries of dominion, edge toward a confrontation that will reshape the map of the Near East. Yet within this looming clash, one figure stands out. A commander whose decisions, timing, and intuition seem almost impossibly precise. Observers at the time struggled to understand how he moved so quickly, how he read the field so clearly, how he managed to hold an improvised army together against a far larger force. Some later accounts describe his maneuvers at Yarmouk as perfect, though no battle of this scale is ever truly perfect. What is certain is that the road to that moment, Khalid ibn al-Walid's defining trial, began long before the armies ever saw each other across the ravine. He was born in Mecca in the late 6th century into a world shaped by tribal loyalties, harsh landscapes, and the delicate balance between survival and honor. The Arabian Peninsula of his youth was a crossroads of caravan routes where merchants carried goods and stories between the great neighboring powers. Byzantines to the northwest, Sasanians to the northeast, and an intricate web of tribes in between created a region that was always shifting, rarely still. In this environment, a child learned early that every decision carried weight. A misjudged alliance, an affront to a rival clan, or even a reckless word could ignite conflict. Within this world, the young Khalid grew up in the prominent Banu Makhzum clan, surrounded by relatives who valued discipline, horsemanship, and mastery of arms. Some early anecdotes, though difficult to verify, suggest that he trained rigorously in riding and swordsmanship, treating these not merely as skills, but as the fundamentals of survival. Whether the tales of his youthful prowess are embellished or not, he lived in a society where martial readiness was a basic expectation, where a man's ability to protect his tribe often defined his standing. Around him, Mecca was undergoing changes that were subtle at first, but soon impossible to ignore. New ideas and teachings appeared, challenging long-held traditions and unsettling the city's hierarchy. Trade continued to flourish, yet beneath the surface, tensions simmered, hinting at fractures that could one day widen into something far greater. It was in this atmosphere of transition, between old and new, between fragile stability and looming upheaval, that Khalid's early experiences took shape, setting the stage for the decisions that would eventually lead him to the battlefields of Syria and ultimately to the ravine of the Yarmuk. From an early age, Khalid ibn al-Walid moved through the world with a clear awareness of hierarchy, responsibility, and the fragile machinery of power that kept tribes united. In Mecca, every family understood its role, and the Banu Makhzum carried the expectation of strength. For Khalid, this became more than an inherited duty, it grew into a personal pursuit. Some historians believe he sought not dominance for its own sake, but mastery of the battlefield, of human movement, of the silent language between fear and courage. In the stories preserved about his youth, he appears as someone who tried to understand how people behaved under pressure, watching how clans negotiated disputes, or how caravans coordinated in dangerous stretches of the desert. Whether these accounts captured his true motivations or painted them in hindsight is uncertain, but they hint at an early desire to understand the patterns that governed conflict. In the evenings, the fires around Mecca flickered with conversations about raids, alliances, and warnings carried by travelers from distant regions. The Byzantine and Sasanian empires, though far from the sheltered valleys of the Hijaz, loomed in the imagination as vast and restless forces. Caravan leaders told of shifting borders, of frontier skirmishes where imperial troops tested each other's resolve, of governors who rose and fell with dizzying speed.
These tales left an impression on a young man who even then seemed drawn to the movements of armies and the fates of soldiers. It's possible that he envisioned a future beyond the narrow confines of tribal warfare, though no direct source confirms this. What is clearer is that he developed, step by step, a fascination with strategy, how a single decision could cascade through an entire campaign. As Mecca's internal tensions deepened, Khalid's ambition grew more defined. The rise of the early Muslim community challenged the established order, creating a rift that extended into nearly every household. For Khalid, whose clan was invested in maintaining the old structure, the shift brought both uncertainty and opportunity. Some accounts describe him as a man who valued stability above ideology, who measured events in terms of their impact on cohesion and power. If this is true, then his early opposition to the new movement can be understood not as hostility toward belief, but as resistance to disruption. He wanted clarity, an environment where decisions had predictable outcomes and loyalties were unambiguous. And when the tension finally erupted into open conflict at battles such as Uhud, Khalid's role as a cavalry commander began to crystallize. At Uhud, he famously exploited a gap in the opposing line, a maneuver still studied for its decisiveness. Though these early battles belong to a period of opposition before his later conversion, they are often cited as evidence of his emerging talent, an ability to see the field not as a jumble of moving parts, but as a living system of strengths and weaknesses. Whether he consciously articulated this as a desire at the time is unknown, but his actions imply a drive to test himself, to refine the craft of command. After his eventual acceptance of Islam, a shift presented in sources with varying detail and interpretations, Khalid's ambitions took a broader, more complex shape. He entered a community that was itself balancing aspiration with survival, confronting threats from surrounding tribes and powerful empires. In this landscape, his desire evolved into something larger than tribal prestige. The new polity needed commanders who could navigate unfamiliar territories, negotiate delicate alliances, and adapt to forms of warfare unlike those of Arabia. He stepped into this role with remarkable speed, taking part in campaigns that pushed across the peninsula and beyond. In these years, his purpose seemed to center on mastery through adaptability. He appeared driven to understand how different people fought, how terrain shaped decisions, how morale could shift the balance even before weapons clashed. During the Ridda conflicts, he faced tribes whose loyalties fractured in unpredictable ways. Some records suggest he approached these campaigns with a blend of firmness and calculation, tracking the psychological dimensions of resistance. Though the specifics of each engagement are debated, the overall picture suggests a man sharpening his instincts while testing the limits of mobility and timing, elements that would define his later triumphs. As the Muslim state turned its attention northward, towards the great powers of Byzantium and Persia, Khalid's ambitions expanded once more. Confronting empires that had stood for centuries required more than battlefield skill. It demanded a deep understanding of logistics, diplomacy, and the fragile alliances that held regions together. Some historians argue that Khalid recognized this challenge early, shaping his campaigns with an eye toward speed and surprise rather than sheer numbers. His legendary march across the desert from Iraq to Syria, a feat many accounts consider extraordinary, reflects a desire to prove not just courage, but the viability of rapid, unconventional movement in a landscape where larger armies relied on fixed routes. In Syria, this ambition became intertwined with responsibility. Muslim forces in the region faced scattered fronts, uncertain support from local populations, and the daunting presence of Byzantine fortifications. Khalid's arrival, assuming the sources are accurate, brought coherence to these disjointed elements. Villages, garrisons, and mixed tribal contingents needed not only leadership, but reassurance, evidence that someone understood the larger pattern behind the scattered conflicts. He traveled between encampments, observing details that many commanders might have overlooked: the condition of horses, the placement of tents, the mood of men who had been far from home for months. Some narratives suggest he adjusted deployment repeatedly, anticipating that the Byzantines would attempt to isolate smaller contingents. This constant refinement reflects not desperation, but a focused ambition to craft a force that could survive the first blow, maneuver under pressure, and then counterattack at the precise moment when morale and positioning aligned.
Underlying these preparations was a deeper, more personal desire to understand the challenge in front of him without illusions. The Byzantine Empire represented not just a military opponent, but an entire system of logistics, engineering, and statecraft. Facing such an adversary demanded humility as much as confidence. It is possible that Khalid saw Yarmuk not simply as a battlefield, but as a test of everything he had learned, from tribal skirmishes in Arabia to multi-front campaigns in Iraq and Syria. The desire to meet that test fully, to orchestrate a response that balanced audacity with restraint, emerges again and again in descriptions of his leadership. As the armies moved into position near the deep ravines carved by the Yarmuk River, Khalid's ambition reached its sharpest point. He wanted not just victory, but understanding, to see the field clearly, to anticipate the Byzantine formations, to guide his own forces with precision. Every decision he made in these last hours, shifting units, reinforcing flanks, directing cavalry reserves, suggests a commander striving to align his purpose with the intricate demands of the moment. What he sought, above all, was control in an environment that offered none, a way to shape the flow of battle against an enemy whose numbers dwarfed his own. And though no battle ever unfolds exactly as imagined, the desire that had guided him from childhood, the quest to master the dynamics of conflict, would soon collide with forces larger than any single commander. At Yarmuk, that desire would be tested in ways even he could not fully anticipate. The road to Yarmuk narrowed long before either army saw the ravine. In the months leading up to the battle, the challenges facing Khalid ibn al-Walid were not merely military, they were structural, strategic, and deeply human. The early Muslim forces in Syria were spread thin across a patchwork of towns and frontier settlements. Each contingent balanced local negotiations, shifting loyalties, and the unpredictable movements of Byzantine patrols. Even before the great imperial army assembled, the region itself seemed to resist certainty. Some commanders feared that the alliances binding their Arab allies could unravel at the slightest hint of Byzantine strength. Others worried about long supply lines stretching back toward Arabia. Moving through these overlapping worries, Khalid confronted a landscape where information traveled slowly and rumors traveled fast. When word arrived that the Byzantines were amassing a large multi-ethnic force, possibly one of the largest concentrated in the region in years, it posed a direct threat to the small Muslim detachments scattered across Syria. The sheer scale of the coming army is difficult to confirm. Some accounts describe tens of thousands, others imply far larger numbers. What is clear is that the imbalance intimidated many in the Muslim ranks. Commanders debated whether to hold their positions or consolidate. Some historians suggest that internal disagreements nearly fractured the leadership before Khalid stepped in to impose unity. The tension was palpable. If they stayed scattered, they risked being overwhelmed one by one. If they gathered, they risked being pinned against the desert with nowhere to retreat. The terrain of southern Syria added new layers of uncertainty.
Deep ravines, volcanic rock fields, and narrow plains forced armies into awkward formations. Scouts returned with conflicting reports about the most defensible positions. Water sources, already scarce, created anxiety throughout the ranks. A single miscalculation could trap the Muslim forces in an unforgiving valley or leave them exposed to the superior Byzantine cavalry. Khalid's efforts to move the entire army towards a more cohesive position required not only tactical judgment, but delicate negotiation with commanders who had grown accustomed to autonomy. Some resisted, unwilling to abandon towns they had worked hard to secure. Yet staying put carried its own risks. The region's villages watched the troop movements with uncertainty, unsure which side might ultimately prevail and shape their future. As the Muslim forces withdrew toward Yarmuk, they did so under pressure. Byzantine detachments shadowed them, probing their flanks, testing their resolve. Some sources hint at moments when communication broke down and units nearly lost their way in the rocky terrain. Each night, campfires flickered with fears that the enemy might launch a sudden encirclement. The sense of vulnerability weighed heavily on soldiers who had traveled far from their homelands. For many, this was unfamiliar ground, different soil, different winds, different kinds of silence at night. The emotional strain of confronting an empire famed for its armies added to the burden. Some veterans of earlier conflicts whispered comparisons to battles where Arab forces had been outmatched, reinforcing doubts that Khalid had to manage with controlled urgency. Inside the Byzantine camp, challenges mirrored those of the Muslim ranks. The commanding generals, drawn from different regions and political spheres, struggled to coordinate their strategies. The multi-ethnic composition of the army, Armenians, Slavs, local levies, and imperial regulars, created friction, as each group had its own expectations for engagement. Some historians believe that the Byzantine leadership underestimated the mobility of Khalid's cavalry, assuming that a larger force with established supply lines could dictate the terms of battle. Yet internal pressures strained their unity. Civil conflicts in the empire's recent past had shaken trust among commanders, and the threat of Persian advances elsewhere diverted imperial attention. These complications helped shape the imperfect coordination that Khalid would soon exploit, but at the time, the full extent of Byzantine division remained unclear to the Muslim scouts.
Within Khalid's own army, morale fluctuated. Some soldiers, seasoned by earlier campaigns, trusted his ability to maneuver them out of danger. Others felt the weight of the numbers arrayed against them. The presence of families, wives and children who had traveled with parts of the army, added another layer of vulnerability. Their cries and anxieties carried across the night air, reminding the soldiers that retreat was not simply a tactical option, but a question of survival for their entire community. Khalid had to address these fears while preparing for a battle whose outcome none could predict. He moved from unit to unit, reassuring commanders, clarifying positions, and attempting to hold the fragile cohesion of his force together. As the armies finally came into proximity near the Yarmuk Valley, new obstacles emerged. Strong winds swept across the plateau, stirring dust that made reconnaissance difficult. The Byzantine camp, vast and orderly, seemed like a city of tents against the horizon. Its sheer size weighed on the minds of observers. Some accounts describe moments when younger soldiers froze at the sight, unsure how an army so small could contest one so large. Khalid had to counter this psychological disadvantage, emphasizing mobility over mass and encouraging his men to view the battlefield as a series of opportunities rather than a single overwhelming threat. Yet his greatest challenge in these days before the clash was uncertainty. The Byzantines did not immediately press the attack. Instead, they maneuvered, signaling intentions that were difficult to interpret.
Some units shifted toward the Muslim flanks, suggesting a plan to encircle. Others remained stationary, implying hesitation or internal disagreement. Khalid had to guess not only when the battle would begin, but how the enemy might strike. His scouts reported conflicting movements, and the terrain distorted the sound of marching units, making it difficult to estimate distances. For a commander who relied on clarity and timing, this ambiguity posed a direct challenge to the precision he valued so deeply.
When the battle finally broke out, the opening engagements exposed the tension between Khalid's plans and the realities of the field. Byzantine infantry formations, dense and disciplined, pushed forward with steady force, driving wedges into parts of the Muslim line. Some units struggled to hold their positions. Dust rose in thick clouds, obscuring signals and creating confusion. The cries of horses and the clash of shields echoed through the valley, mixing with the shouts of officers trying to maintain order. Khalid was forced to reposition cavalry reserves earlier than he intended, an adjustment that risked weakening his ability to respond later in the battle. There were moments when parts of the Muslim line bent under pressure, threatening to break. Accounts differ on how close they came to collapse, but many sources emphasize the intensity of these early pushes. Officers fought to keep their men steady, urging them to hold just long enough for relief forces to arrive. Khalid, moving constantly across the field, confronted the limits of his control. He relied on the experience of sub-commanders whose judgment varied widely, and any miscommunication could unravel the delicate balance he sought to maintain. The heat, the dust, the noise, all compounded to create a battlefield that defied clean execution. Even success carried its own dangers. When the Muslim cavalry achieved brief local advantages, pursuing too far risked overextending and exposing the flanks. When they withdrew, they risked being caught by Byzantine countercharges. Khalid's challenge was to hold this fluid movement together under conditions where visibility, timing, and morale changed from moment to moment. The grand strategy he had envisioned collided with the unpredictable nature of combat. Horses stumbled on uneven ground, units lost sight of their standards in swirling dust, and sudden shifts in wind carried orders in unintended directions. Through all this, the greatest obstacle remained the sheer resiliency of the Byzantine army. Despite internal disagreements, their lines held with remarkable discipline. Their cavalry, though not as mobile as Khalid's, pressed with determination. Their infantry advanced in coordinated blocks that required the Muslim forces to constantly adjust. For hours, neither side gained decisive advantage. The fatigue grew palpable. Soldiers fought not only the enemy, but exhaustion, thirst, and the mental strain of uncertainty. By the time the second day of fighting ended, it was clear that the obstacles Khalid faced were not diminishing, they were compounding. The terrain had not become friendlier, the Byzantine forces had not broken, the morale of his own men teetered between trust and fear, and the outcome of the conflict, still unwritten, weighed heavily on every decision he made. The battle was far from over, and the true turning point had yet to arrive. At dawn on the next day, the dark ridgelines overlooking the Yarmuk Valley glowed faintly as the sun rose behind a curtain of dust. The air carried a muted stillness, the kind that hangs over a battlefield before the next wave of violence. For Khalid ibn al-Walid, this day marked a threshold. The setbacks, the confusion, and the precarious balancing of morale over the previous clashes had pushed his army close to its limits. Yet beneath the exhaustion, something else stirred, a quiet recognition among his soldiers that they had survived the worst of the opening assaults. The Byzantines had not shattered them, they had held, and in that endurance lay the faintest hint of possibility. Khalid sensed it in the way his veterans tightened their grips on spears, in the small nods exchanged across the ranks, in the silence that felt less like despair and more like preparation.
During these fragile hours, he moved across the camp, assessing each unit with an intensity sharpened by long experience. Reports had filtered in throughout the night, some accurate, others colored by fear, describing Byzantine movements along the flanks. The enemy seemed ready to renew their pressure, but the coordination that had once seemed overwhelming now revealed subtle signs of strain. Some historians believe that internal debates among the Byzantine commanders grew sharper at this point, slowing their decision-making. Others suggest that their multi-ethnic contingents struggled to maintain cohesion after days of attrition. Khalid could not know the full truth, yet he observed enough on the field to sense a change. The Byzantine momentum, so forceful at the start, no longer carried the same unity of purpose. Still, uncertainty lingered. The winds blowing across the plateau shifted unpredictably, carrying sand that blurred distances and muffled sound. Scouts attempting to track enemy cavalry patrols often reported contradictory sightings. Even the ravine itself, which wound like a fractured scar through the landscape, distorted perspectives. Khalid faced a crucial dilemma. If the Byzantines resumed their offensive with synchronized force, his army, tired, outnumbered, and hemmed in by the terrain, might not withstand another sustained push. Yet if they hesitated or exposed a weakness, the window for a counterstroke could open only briefly before closing again. It was in balancing these possibilities that the turning point began to take shape, not as a single moment, but as a gradual alignment of conditions. The first signs emerged when the Byzantine left wing advanced more tentatively than expected. Their cavalry, normally confident on open ground, seemed cautious near the uneven basalt patches that lay between them and the Muslim right. Some accounts describe the hesitation as the product of miscommunication, orders that were unclear or delayed. Others attributed to the cumulative fatigue of soldiers who had marched and fought for days without decisive progress. From Khalid's vantage point, the effect was unmistakable. Pressure that had been consistent now pulsed unevenly, leaving intervals of stillness between assaults. These intervals mattered. They gave space for breath, for repositioning, for recalibrating morale. Recognizing the significance of this shift, Khalid began tightening his reserve formations, particularly his mobile cavalry groups, forces he had carefully preserved despite the temptation to commit them earlier. He spoke with commanders whose units had been battered in the previous engagements, urging them to hold firm for a little longer, hinting that the moment they needed was approaching. Many of these leaders had fought under him for years and understood the weight behind his words. They spread that confidence through their exhausted ranks, reminding their men that battles often hinged on timing rather than sheer endurance. By midday, the Byzantines launched another push, but its momentum faltered as their center met stubborn resistance along the Muslim lines. Shields clashed with a dull, rhythmic cadence, and dust clouds thickened until entire sections of the battlefield became silhouettes. Khalid rode along the rear slopes, his horse navigating the uneven terrain with practiced precision. The sound of metal on metal, mixed with the cries of officers struggling to maintain cohesion, guided him more than sight. From these sounds, he pieced together the rhythm of the combat, listening for points where his presence might stabilize a wavering unit or reinforce a faltering flank. At one critical point, the Byzantine right pressed hard against the Muslim left, pushing them back towards a patch of unstable ground. Panic flickered through the ranks as men slipped on loose stones, their formations bending dangerously. Khalid intervened with a decisive shift, dispatching a portion of his cavalry to relieve the pressure. The maneuver, though risky, bought crucial time. Instead of collapsing, the Muslim left rebounded, regaining enough stability to maintain the line. The Byzantines achieved no breakthrough, and their advance stalled once more.
It was during these exchanges that Khalid began to notice signs of fragmentation in the Byzantine force. Their cavalry units, normally fluid in their movements, seemed less coordinated. Infantry blocks that had advanced with unified discipline earlier now moved unevenly, with gaps widening between adjacent formations. Some historians believe these reflected disagreements among their officers. Others suggest attrition and fatigue had thinned their ranks without time to reorganize. Whatever the cause, the effect was unmistakable. The cohesion that had defined their early assaults was slowly unraveling. Sensing the shift, Khalid prepared for a coordinated maneuver of his own. He had held back his most mobile cavalry for precisely such a moment, waiting for the enemy's rhythm to falter. Before committing them, he rode toward the center, weaving through lines of weary soldiers who tried to catch glimpses of him through the dust. Some men later recalled how he paused briefly at key points, offering measured words of encouragement. Whether these recollections are literal or shaped by memory's embellishment, they capture the emotional significance of the moment. The army needed to believe that its commander saw a path to survival, even if the path was not yet visible to them. The actual turning point, when pressure shifted from Khalid's army to the Byzantines, unfolded in a series of movements rather than a singular strike. The first came when the Muslim right wing, which had held up against repeated assaults, began to stabilize and even push forward slightly. This movement, though modest, forced the Byzantine left to adjust its formation. The adjustment weakened their link to the center, creating the opening Khalid had been waiting for. He dispatched a wave of cavalry toward this evolving gap, instructing them to disrupt rather than overextend. Their charge, timed with unusual precision, collided with the Byzantine flank at the exact moment its cohesion faltered. The impact rippled outward. Byzantine infantry units, suddenly pressured from an unexpected angle, struggled to reform. Officers shouted orders that were lost in the wind and dust. The shifting ground beneath their feet made it difficult to pivot quickly. For the first time in the battle, parts of their line fell into disarray. Khalid seized the moment, committing more of his cavalry reserves to widen the breach. These were not reckless charges, but calculated strikes aimed at destabilizing key points. The cumulative effect was profound. The Byzantine center, previously the anchor of their formation, began pulling back unevenly. As the pressure mounted, Byzantine commanders attempted to restore order, but the complexity of coordinating such a large, diverse army under chaotic conditions worked against them. Their lines continued to bend, and as they did, the sprawling plateau that had once seemed an advantage turned into a labyrinth of confusion. Dust storms, stirred by thousands of moving feet, obscured markers and standards that soldiers relied on for orientation. Units lost track of each other, and their ability to respond cohesively diminished further. During these crucial hours, Khalid's movements became almost continuous. He rode along the front, shifting units with rapid-fire decisions that reflected his deep familiarity with the terrain. He repositioned light cavalry to exploit openings, directed infantry to reinforce critical segments, and issued signals that guided his forces with a coherence that contrasted sharply with the growing disorder among the Byzantines. Some sources emphasize the almost uncanny timing of his commands. Others attribute his decisions to the seasoned instinct of a commander who had fought across multiple regions and understood how battlefields breathe and change. As the breakthrough widened, the psychological balance shifted dramatically. Soldiers on the Muslim side, who had spent days fighting defensively, now sensed the possibility of turning the tide. They pushed forward with renewed determination, their movements aligning with Khalid's increasingly assertive strategy. Meanwhile, Byzantine troops, confronted with mounting pressure from multiple angles, began to withdraw, some in organized fashion, others in fragmented groups. The terrain, particularly the proximity of the ravines, complicated their withdrawal. Paths that seemed clear
quickly narrowed or ended abruptly, forcing units to redirect and creating traffic that slowed the entire withdrawal. In the unfolding chaos, Khalid intensified his efforts to maintain discipline among his own men. He signaled repeatedly for measured advances, wary that a premature surge could overextend his forces and give the Byzantines space to recover. Yet, his cavalry, guided by scouts familiar with the ravine edges, maintained relentless pressure on the retreating wings. The coordination of these movements reflected a shift not only in strategy, but in momentum. The battle, which had hung in precarious balance for days, now tilted decisively. By late afternoon, the Byzantine retreat accelerated into a hurried withdrawal across the plateau. Their earlier numerical advantage had dissolved, replaced by the challenge of navigating difficult terrain under pressure. Khalid continued to direct his forces with calibrated precision, ensuring their pursuit did not devolve into disorganized chaos. Some accounts describe this stage as a masterclass in controlled aggression, an ability to push just hard enough to prevent regrouping without losing cohesion. As shadows lengthened across the battlefield, the significance of what had happened became clear. The shift at Yarmuk was not simply a military reversal, but the culmination of days of attrition, adaptation, and psychological endurance. Khalid's ability to read the battle as a series of unfolding patterns, to anticipate fractures and exploit them with speed, had transformed an army on the defensive into one seizing the initiative. This turning point, shaped by dust, exhaustion, and the uncertainties of human decision-making, would pave the way for the final result that would echo far beyond the ravine and the plateau on which the armies had clashed. As the final day faded into dusk, the plateau above the Yarmuk River fell into a heavy, wind-carried silence. The dust of the long struggle drifted slowly across abandoned shields and trampled earth. In that quiet, the scale of what had unfolded began to settle. The Byzantine army, so vast, so established, so deeply rooted in the region's history, had withdrawn in disarray toward the ravines, many units scattering across terrain that offered no safe path. The Muslim forces, though exhausted, stood in stunned recognition of how narrow the margins had been. Victory had not come from sheer force. It had emerged from endurance, from adaptability, and from Khalid ibn al-Walid's ability to guide his army through days when collapse had seemed only moments away. When the fires were lit that night, the mood across the camp was subdued rather than triumphant. Men tended to wounds, whispered about narrow escapes, and looked toward the dark horizon where the enemy had vanished. Some historians suggest that Khalid moved among them quietly, offering neither speeches nor celebration. His focus, they believe, rested on the cost of the battle and the responsibilities that followed. Yarmuk had opened the road into Syria, reshaping the region's future, yet the victory carried emotional weight, a recognition of lives lost and of a world shifting in ways no single commander could fully predict. In the years that followed, the battle's legacy grew. Chronicles portrayed it as a decisive moment in the struggle between empires, and Khalid's role became a symbol of strategic clarity under impossible pressure. Yet behind the legend remains a more human story, a commander navigating uncertainty, an army surviving against the odds, and a turning point shaped not by myth, but by the fragile decisions of ordinary men caught in an extraordinary moment.